The sun hung low over Clearwater, casting long shadows across the dusty Main Street. It was the summer of 1876, and the small Wyoming town baked under relentless heat that turned the earth to powder beneath horses' hooves and wagon wheels. Elizabeth Hartley stood at the window of her family's modest, clapboard house, watching tumbleweeds roll past like ghosts of better times. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that drew unwanted attention in a frontier town: honey blonde hair that caught sunlight like spun gold, eyes the color of prairie sky after rain, and a grace that seemed out of place among the rough-hewn buildings and harder people. But beauty was a luxury the Hartleys could no longer afford. "Elizabeth, come away from there." Her mother, Margaret, called weakly from the parlor. The consumption had taken hold 6 months ago, and each day seemed to steal more of her strength. Medical bills had mounted alongside the debts from her father's failed mining venture, creating a mountain of obligations that threatened to bury them all. Through the thin walls, Elizabeth could hear her father, Thomas, arguing with someone in the kitchen. The voices rose and fell like thunder rolling across the plains. She recognized the other man, Josiah Blackwood, the town's most influential banker, a man whose wealth was matched only by his cruelty. 3 months, Hartley, that's all you've got left." Blackwood's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Unless you accept my generous offer." Elizabeth's stomach turned. She knew exactly what that offer entailed. Blackwood's son, Samuel, had been pursuing her with increasing aggression, and the banker saw an opportunity to secure what his son desired while tightening his grip on the Hartley family. The door slammed, rattling the entire house. Elizabeth hurried to the kitchen to find her father slumped at the table, his weathered face buried in calloused hands. At 52, Thomas Hartley looked 70, broken by failed dreams and the harsh realities of frontier life. "Papa?" she ventured softly. He looked up, eyes red-rimmed with unshed tears. "I'm sorry. Lizzie, I've failed you all." What did Mr. Blackwood want? Thomas couldn't meet her eyes. "He's calling in our debts. We'll lose everything. The house, your mother's medicine." His voice cracked. Unless I marry Samuel," Elizabeth finished, her voice hollow. "There's another way." Thomas suddenly straightened, a spark of hope flickering in his eyes. "Jake McCord." Elizabeth frowned. She knew the name. Everyone in Clearwater did. Jake McCord was a cattleman who owned a small ranch about 10 miles outside town, a loner who rarely came to town except for supplies. He had a reputation for being fair but hard as nails. Rumors swirled about his past. Some said he'd been a gunfighter. Others claimed he'd lost his family to Indian raids. Nobody knew for certain because Jake McCord didn't talk about himself. "What about him?" Elizabeth asked. "He needs a wife," Thomas said quickly. "Came to me last week, quiet-like. Said he'd pay off our debts if you'd marry him. Give us enough to get your mother to that sanitarium in Denver, too." Elizabeth felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "You're selling me either way." "No!" Thomas reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "McCord's a decent man, hard-working. He'd treat you right, with Samuel Blackwood." He shuddered. "You know what kind of man he is." She did know. Samuel Blackwood had cornered her behind the general store last month, his breath stinking of whiskey, his hands grabbing at her until she'd managed to knee him and run. His father's money kept him above the law, and his cruelty was legend among the young women of Clearwater. "When?" Elizabeth asked, feeling her future slip away like sand through fingers. "McCord said he'd come by tomorrow if you're willing. The wedding would be at week's end." Elizabeth walked back to the window, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The sky bled red and orange, beautiful and terrible at once. She thought of her mother, growing weaker each day, of her younger sisters, Sarah and Mary, who deserved better than watching their family destroyed, of her own dreams, teaching school, perhaps traveling east to see the ocean, evaporating like morning dew. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears burning her eyes. "I'll marry Jake McCord." The next afternoon, Elizabeth stood on the porch wearing her best dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. She'd pinned her hair up carefully, trying to look like a proper bride-to-be rather than a desperate girl with no choices left. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. A lone rider approached, sitting easy in the saddle despite the rough gait of his horse. As he drew closer, Elizabeth got her first good look at Jake McCord. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with the kind of build that came from years of hard labor. Broad shoulders filled out his worn leather vest, and his face was tanned dark from endless days under the sun. Dark hair showed beneath his hat brim, and when he dismounted and looked up at her, she saw eyes the color of storm clouds. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His nose had been broken at least once, and a thin scar ran from his left temple to his jaw. But there was something about him, a quiet strength that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "Miss Hartley," he said, removing his hat. His voice was deep, roughened by wind and weather. "Your father said you're willing, not pleased to meet you, or you look lovely today. Just straight to business." Elizabeth lifted her chin. "I am." He studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he could see straight through her brave facade to the fear beneath. "You know anything about ranch life?" "I can learn. It's hard work. No servants, no fancy dresses. Just survival." "I said I can learn," Elizabeth repeated, sharper this time. Something that might have been approval flickered in his eyes. "Fair enough." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, tossing it to her father, who had appeared in the doorway. "That should cover the debts and the sanitarium. Wedding's on Sunday. I'll send a wagon for your things." He turned to go, then paused. "You should know, I'm not looking for love, Miss Hartley. Just need a wife to help run the ranch. Maybe give me sons to carry on the name. You'll have food, shelter, protection. That's all I'm offering." Elizabeth's pride flared. "I'm not looking for love either, Mr. McCord. Just survival for my family." He nodded once, mounted his horse, and rode away without looking back. Sunday came too quickly. The wedding was a sparse affair in the small church at the edge of town. Elizabeth wore her mother's wedding dress, taken in to fit her smaller frame. Jake wore what appeared to be his only good suit, black and severe. The few townspeople who attended whispered behind their hands, some pitying, others envious of the Hartleys' escape from Blackwood's clutches. Samuel Blackwood himself stood at the back of the church, his face twisted with rage. As Elizabeth walked past him on Jake's arm after the ceremony, he hissed, "This isn't over. You'll regret choosing that saddle tramp over me." Jake stopped, turning slowly to face Samuel. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The look in his storm cloud eyes was enough to make Samuel step back, suddenly remembering the rumors about Jake McCord's past. As they climbed into the wagon to leave for the ranch, Elizabeth caught sight of her family. Her mother, propped up between her sisters, managed an encouraging smile. Her father looked relieved and ashamed in equal measure. Sarah and Mary waved bravely, trying not to cry. "You can visit them," Jake said quietly, surprising her. "Once a month, if you like." Elizabeth nodded, not trusting her voice. As the wagon rolled out of Clearwater, she didn't look back. She was no longer Elizabeth Hartley, the girl with dreams. She was Elizabeth McCord, wife to a stranger, bound by necessity rather than choice. The wedding ring, a simple gold band, felt heavy on her finger. She touched it absently, wondering what lay ahead at the ranch 10 miles into the wilderness. Whatever it was, she would face it. She had no other choice. She had been forced to marry, sold to save her family. But as she stole a glance at the silent man beside her, his strong hand steady on the reins, his profile sharp against the endless sky, Elizabeth felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. Perhaps Jake McCord would be her salvation, or perhaps he would be another kind of prison entirely. Only time would tell. The wagon lurched over another rut, jolting Elizabeth from her thoughts. They'd been traveling for over an hour in complete silence. The only sounds, the creak of wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves. The landscape had changed from the relative civilization of Clearwater to raw, untamed prairie, endless grassland broken only by scattered rock formations and the occasional scraggly tree. "There," Jake said suddenly, pointing ahead. Elizabeth squinted against the late afternoon sun. A cluster of buildings materialized from the heat shimmer, a modest 2-story house, a barn that had seen better days, a few outbuildings, and a corral where several horses milled about. It wasn't the poverty she'd feared, but it was far from prosperous. As they pulled up to the house, a mangy dog emerged from beneath the porch, barking half-heartedly before recognizing Jake and wagging its tail. The house itself was weathered but solid, built from logs chinked with mud. The windows were real glass, a luxury Elizabeth hadn't expected. Jake helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong but impersonal at her waist. "I'll show you around," he said, grabbing her small trunk as if it weighed nothing. The inside was sparse but clean. A main room served as both kitchen and living area, dominated by a large stone fireplace. A narrow staircase led to what she assumed were bedrooms above. Everything was functional. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a few shelves holding dishes and supplies. No decorations, no softness, no woman's touch. "You'll want to change," Jake said, setting her trunk by the stairs. "Ranch clothes are in the bedroom. Belong to—" He stopped, jaw tightening. They should fit well enough. Belong to whom? Elizabeth wondered but didn't ask. She climbed the stairs, finding 2 rooms, one obviously Jake's, with a narrow bed and a rifle propped in the corner. The other held a larger bed, a washstand, and a wooden chest. Inside the chest, she found several worn but serviceable dresses, more practical than anything she owned. She changed quickly, the calico feeling strange against her skin. Someone else's clothes, someone else's life. When she returned downstairs, Jake was stoking the fire in the cook stove. "Can you cook?" he asked without preamble. Yes, her mother had insisted all her daughters learn, even when they'd had servants. "Good. Supplies are in the pantry. I eat at sundown." He headed for the door, then paused. "There's a loaded shotgun by the kitchen door. You know how to use it?" "No. I'll teach you tomorrow. Don't go far from the house without it. Rattlers, coyotes. Sometimes worse." And with that comforting thought, he was gone. Elizabeth stood alone in the silent kitchen, fighting down panic. What had she gotten herself into? She forced herself to move, exploring the pantry, salt pork, beans, flour, cornmeal, preserved vegetables, dried meat. Basic fare. She could work with this. By the time Jake returned as the sun touched the horizon, she had beef stew simmering and fresh biscuits cooling. He washed at the pump outside, then entered, stopping short at the sight of the set table. "Smells good," he admitted, sitting down. They ate in silence. Elizabeth watched him covertly. He had good table manners despite his rough appearance. And he ate steadily, but without the desperate hunger of a man who'd gone without. When he finished, he pushed back his plate with a satisfied sigh. "That was fine," he said, the first real compliment he'd given her. "Better than my cooking by a long shot." "Thank you." She began clearing the dishes, but he stood. "I'll help. 2 hands make lighter work." They washed and dried side by side, still silent but less awkward. When the last dish was put away, Jake gestured to the chairs by the fireplace. "We should talk about arrangements." Elizabeth's heart hammered as she sat. This was what she'd been dreading. "You'll have the upstairs bedroom," he said, staring into the fire. "I'll bunk down here for now. When you're ready, if you're ready, we'll discuss other things. I'm not a man to force what isn't freely given." Relief flooded through her so suddenly she almost gasped. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded curtly. "Dawn comes early. Best get some rest." The days fell into a pattern. Jake woke before dawn, did chores, ate the breakfast she prepared, then rode out to tend the cattle. Elizabeth found herself overwhelmed by the sheer amount of work. Cooking, cleaning, mending. tending the vegetable garden that had gone wild, feeding chickens she hadn't even known they had. Her soft hands blistered from the lye soap and scrub brush. Her back ached from bending over the washboard. The sun burned her fair skin until it peeled. By evening, she could barely stay awake through dinner. Jake noticed but said nothing, though sometimes she caught him watching her with an unreadable expression. Once, she dozed off at the table, jerking awake to find a blanket draped over her shoulders. The first real crisis came at the end of the first week. Elizabeth was gathering eggs when one of the horses in the corral started screaming, a terrible, almost human sound. She ran outside to see the animal down, thrashing, Jake trying desperately to calm it. "Snakebite," he said tersely. "Fetch my rifle." "No!" The word burst from her. The horse was a beautiful mare, coal-black with a white star on her forehead. "There must be something. There isn't. She's suffering." His voice was hard, but his eyes were pained. "The rifle, Elizabeth, now!" She brought it with shaking hands. Jake took it, checked the load, then knelt by the mare's head, stroking her neck and murmuring something too low to hear. The shot, when it came, made Elizabeth flinch. Jake stood slowly, his face carved from stone. "Get the shovel," he said. "We'll bury her in the east pasture." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said as they worked together to dig the grave, her hands raw and bleeding by the end. "Part of ranch life," Jake said shortly, but she saw him place his hand on the fresh earth for a long moment before walking away. That night, he spoke more than usual. Her name was Midnight, raised her from a foal, best cow horse I ever had. He stared into his coffee cup. "This land takes everything eventually. The weak don't survive out here." "I'm not weak," Elizabeth said, surprising herself with her vehemence. He looked at her then, really looked at her, taking in her blistered hands, sunburned face, the determined set of her jaw. "No," he said slowly. "Maybe you're not." The next morning, he taught her to shoot. She was clumsy at first, the shotgun's kick bruising her shoulder, but she gritted her teeth and kept trying until she could hit the target more often than not. "Good," Jake said. "Remember, out here, hesitation kills. You see a rattler near the house, you shoot. Coyote after the chickens, you shoot. Anyone comes around making trouble." He let the sentence hang. As the second week wore on, Elizabeth began to find her rhythm. She learned to pace herself, to work steadily rather than frantically. She discovered Jake's routines and preferences: coffee black and strong, steak rare, complete silence during breakfast but occasional conversation at dinner. She also began to notice things about him. The way he always checked the horizon before entering the house, a habit that spoke of vigilance born from hard experience. The care he took with his animals, firm but never cruel. The books on a high shelf, Shakespeare, surprisingly, and a worn Bible, and technical manuals on cattle breeding. "You read?" she asked one evening, emboldened by his relatively good mood after a successful day moving cattle. "When I can. Winters are long out here." He glanced at the books. "You're welcome to them." It was the first truly personal thing he'd offered, and Elizabeth treasured it. But the hardest part was the loneliness. Jake was gone from dawn to dusk most days. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. The silence of the prairie pressed in on her, broken only by wind and the occasional cry of a hawk. She found herself talking to the chickens, to the dog, now her constant companion after she'd started slipping him scraps, to herself. One afternoon, exhausted and filthy from scrubbing the floors, she sat on the porch and wept. She missed her sister's laughter, her mother's gentle presence, even her father's worried frown. She missed having friends to talk to, missed the small pleasures of town life, church socials, the general store's gossip, the possibility of something, anything happening. She was so lost in her misery she didn't hear Jake ride up until his shadow fell across her. She hastily wiped her eyes, but it was too late. "You hate it here," he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't," she stopped, unable to lie. "It's just so empty." He dismounted, sitting on the step below her, the closest they'd been since their wedding day. "First year's the hardest. The land seems like an enemy, trying to break you. Some it does break. They go back east or go mad or just give up." His voice dropped. "But some learn to love it. The freedom, the silence, the way the sky goes on forever." "Which were you?" Elizabeth asked softly. "Both," he admitted. "The land broke me, then remade me." He stood abruptly. The moment of intimacy over. "I'm riding to town tomorrow for supplies. You can come if you want." The offer was casually made, but Elizabeth heard what it cost him. Jake McCord didn't like town, didn't like people. He was offering this for her. "Thank you," she said. "I'd like that." He nodded and headed inside, leaving her alone with the setting sun and a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. The trip to town had lifted Elizabeth's spirits, but the fragile peace shattered 3 days later. She was hanging laundry when Jake returned early from the range, his face tight with anger she'd never seen before. "Pack some things," he said curtly. "You're going to stay with the Hendersons for a few days." "What? Why?" The Hendersons were their nearest neighbors, an elderly couple who'd been kind during her town visit. "Just do it." He was already loading his rifle, checking his ammunition. "I will not." Elizabeth planted her feet, hands on her hips. "This is my home too. Whatever's wrong, cattle thieves." He cut her off. "Found 6 head missing this morning. Tracks heading north. I'm going after them." "Then I'm coming with you." "Like hell you are." The profanity, mild as it was, shocked her. Jake never cursed in her presence. "You can't just ship me off whenever there's trouble. I'm your wife, not a child. You're a town girl who's been here 3 weeks. He shot back. "You can barely ride. You've shot a gun exactly 5 times, and you don't know the first thing about tracking rustlers. You'd be a liability." The words stung because they were true, but they also ignited her temper. "Then what am I even doing here? Why did you marry me if I'm so useless?" "I married you because—" He stopped abruptly, jaw clenched. "Because what? Because you needed someone to cook and clean? You could hire help for that. Because you wanted sons? Hard to manage that with me at the Hendersons and you chasing outlaws. So why, Jake? Why did you marry me?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Jake's storm cloud eyes darkened further, and for a moment she thought he might actually answer. Then he turned away. "Because I thought I could keep you safe," he said quietly. "But I can't protect you if you won't let me. Please, Elizabeth. Just this once. Go to the Hendersons." Something in his voice, a rawness she'd never heard, made her relent. "Fine. But when you get back, we're going to talk about this." He was gone before she finished packing. Mrs. Henderson welcomed her warmly, but Elizabeth spent 3 sleepless nights worrying. What if Jake didn't come back? What if the thieves shot him? She'd be a widow after less than a month of marriage, and the surprising pain of that thought told her something had shifted in her feelings. On the 4th morning, she was helping Mrs. Henderson with breakfast when they heard horses. Elizabeth ran outside to see Jake riding in, dusty and exhausted but whole. Relief flooded through her so powerfully her knees weakened. "Did you find them?" Mr. Henderson asked. "Found them. Got the cattle back." Jake's voice was flat, and Elizabeth noticed blood on his sleeve. "You're hurt." She rushed forward, but he waved her off. "It's nothing. Just a graze." He looked at her then, something unreadable in his expression. "Get your things. We're going home." The ride back was silent, but it was a different silence than before, charged with unspoken words. Once home. Elizabeth insisted on tending his wound despite his protests. The graze was a deep gash along his upper arm. "This needs stitches," she said, trying to keep her hand steady as she cleaned it. "Just wrap it tight. It'll heal. Don't be stubborn." She threaded a needle with hands that only shook a little. "This might hurt. Can't be worse than—" He sucked in a breath as she made the first stitch. "Never mind." She worked carefully, trying not to think about how close the wound was to his heart, how easily the bullet could have struck true. When she finished and began wrapping the bandage, she finally gave voice to her anger. "I was terrified," she said quietly. 3 days not knowing if you were dead or alive. And for what? Some cattle? It's not about the cattle." His voice was tight with pain or something else. "Let one thief get away with it. Others follow. Soon you've lost everything. Like you lost before?" His silence was answer enough. Elizabeth tied off the bandage, then surprised herself by placing her hand over it gently. "I'm not her. You know, whoever she was, I'm not going to disappear on you." Jake went very still. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "Her name was Mary, my wife. She died 4 years ago, along with our son. Fever took them while I was on a cattle drive. Came home to 2 graves." Elizabeth's heart clenched. The clothes in the chest, the careful distance he maintained. It all made terrible sense now. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I swore I'd never marry again." "Never risk that kind of pain." He looked at her then, his eyes raw with old grief. "But the ranch was failing. I needed help, and I thought if I married someone I didn't love, it would be easier, safer." The words should have hurt, but Elizabeth understood. Hadn't she thought the same? That a marriage without love would be simpler, cleaner. "Is it?" she asked. "Easier?" "No." The word came out harsh. "No, it's not easier, because you're nothing like I expected. You work until your hands bleed without complaint. You face each challenge head on. You stood up to me just now when most women would have backed down. You're not supposed to be." "What?" Elizabeth prompted softly when he trailed off. "Strong," he finished. "Brave. Beautiful when you're angry." He stood abruptly, stepping away from her touch. "I need to check the stock." He was out the door before she could respond, leaving her standing there with bloodied hands and a racing heart. "Beautiful when you're angry." The words echoed in her mind as she cleaned up the medical supplies. That evening, she made his favorite meal, venison stew with wild onions she'd found growing by the creek. He ate quietly, but she caught him glancing at her throughout dinner. "Thank you," he said finally, "for the doctoring, and for going to the Hendersons, even though it made you angry." "I wasn't angry about going," Elizabeth admitted. "I was angry about being shut out, about not being trusted to handle the truth. The truth is, I've buried one wife already. I won't bury another. You can't protect me from everything. Jake, this land you love so much, it's dangerous. You said so yourself. But I chose to come here. I chose to stay. The least you can do is let me face those dangers as your partner, not your burden." He studied her for a long moment. "You really mean that? You're not planning to run back to town the first chance you get?" "Where would I go?" Elizabeth asked with a wry smile. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't bleed to death the next time you play hero." Something that might have been a smile tugged at his mouth. "Hero? I was just getting my cattle back." While outnumbered 3-1, according to Mr. Henderson, Jake shrugged, then winced as the movement pulled his stitches. "They weren't very good thieves. Neither are you a very good patient. That needs fresh bandages." She stood, gathering supplies. "And don't argue. I've had enough of your stubbornness for one day." He submitted to her ministrations with unusual meekness, and she realized he was exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and she wondered if he'd slept at all while tracking the thieves. "You need a rest," she said, securing the new bandage. "Soon. Need to check. The horses are fed, the chickens are locked up, and I already barred the barn door." At his surprised look, she added, "I'm learning. Remember?" He caught her hand as she turned away, his calloused thumb brushing her knuckles. "Elizabeth, He stopped, struggling with words. "I was forced to marry," she said quietly, turning back to face him. "We both know that. My family needed saving, and you were the only option that didn't make my skin crawl. I hated you for it. At first, hated that you could buy me like cattle. Hated that I had to be grateful for it." Jake's face was unreadable, but he didn't release her hand. "But these past weeks, you've been kind when you could have been cruel. patient when I've made mistakes. You've given me space when I needed it and help when I was too proud to ask." She took a breath, gathering courage. "I don't hate you anymore. Jake, I don't know what I feel exactly, but it's not hate." His hand tightened on hers. "The day I came to your father, I told myself it was just business. I needed a wife. He needed money. Simple trade. But when I saw you that first day, standing on the porch trying to look brave," he shook his head. "Nothing's been simple since." "No," Elizabeth agreed. "It hasn't." They stood there, hands linked, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between them. Then Jake cleared his throat and stepped back, releasing her. "You should get some sleep," he said. "Dawn comes early." Elizabeth nodded, recognizing the retreat but not pushing. They'd crossed some invisible line tonight, acknowledged that what lay between them was more than a business arrangement. It was progress, even if neither quite knew what to do with it. As she climbed the stairs to her solitary bedroom, she touched the simple gold band on her finger. She was forced to marry. That remained true. But for the first time since speaking her vows, she wondered if being Jake McCord's wife might lead to something beyond mere survival. Behind her, she heard Jake settling onto his makeshift bed by the fireplace, and she allowed herself a small smile. He could have his ranch house bedroom back whenever he chose. The fact that he hadn't, that he waited for some sign from her, spoke volumes. The cowboy had made her want him, though neither was quite ready to admit it. But time, Elizabeth thought as she prepared for bed, time might change everything. The autumn harvest celebration in Clearwater should have been a joyful occasion. Elizabeth wore her best dress, one of Mary's that she'd altered to fit, and Jake had even trimmed his beard and worn his good shirt. They'd brought preserves from Elizabeth's garden and a side of beef for the communal feast. For the first time since their marriage 2 months ago, they looked like a proper couple, but the whispers started the moment they entered town. "That's her," Elizabeth heard Mrs. Pritchard mutter to her circle of friends. "The Hartley girl who sold herself to save her family's reputation?" "Poor thing," another woman added with false sympathy. "Imagine being shackled to that hermit. They say he never got over his first wife's death. Probably compares her to Mary every night." Elizabeth's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high. Jake, walking beside her, seemed oblivious to the gossip, or perhaps he was just better at ignoring it. The real trouble began near the church steps. Samuel Blackwood stood there with a group of his friends, all of them showing signs of afternoon drinking despite the early hour. His eyes lit up with malicious glee when he spotted them. "Well, well, the blushing bride and her purchased husband," Samuel called out, loud enough for half the town to hear. "Tell me, McCord, was she worth what you paid, or are you regretting your bargain?" Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. Elizabeth felt his hand tense where it rested at her elbow. "Nothing to say," Samuel persisted, following them. "I suppose she doesn't talk much either. Hard to be romantic when you know your wife would rather be anywhere else." "Samuel, please," Elizabeth said quietly. "There's no need for this." "No need?" Samuel's voice rose. "You humiliated me. Chose a broken-down rancher over me. My father could have given you everything." "Your father could have given me a prison," Elizabeth shot back before she could stop herself. "At least with Jake. I know where I stand." Samuel's face darkened. "With him, you stand in a shack, working like a servant. Look at your hands, rough as a washerwoman's. That dress is 4 years out of fashion. You're wasting away on that ranch while he broods over his dead wife." The crowd that had gathered murmured at this cruel reminder. Elizabeth felt Jake go rigid beside her. "That's enough," Jake said, his voice dangerously low. "Is it?" Samuel stepped closer, emboldened by alcohol and audience. "Everyone knows you can't let go of the past. McCord, that ranch house is still a shrine to Mary. Bet you call her name in your sleep while your new wife lies alone." Jake moved so fast Elizabeth barely saw it. One moment Samuel was sneering, the next He was on the ground, blood streaming from his nose. Jake stood over him, fists clenched, looking like the gunfighter some claimed he'd been. "Jake, no." Elizabeth caught his arm. "He's not worth it. Listen to your wife, McCord," one of Samuel's friends advised, hand hovering near his gun. "Unless you want real trouble." The tension crackled like lightning about to strike. Then Sheriff Watson pushed through the crowd. "That's enough excitement for one day. Samuel, get yourself cleaned up. Jake, Elizabeth, might be best if you head home. We came for the harvest feast." Elizabeth said firmly, "We're staying." The sheriff looked between her determined face and Jake's storm cloud expression. "All right. But any more trouble?" "There won't be," Elizabeth assured him, tightening her grip on Jake's arm. "Will their husband?" Jake looked down at her, something flickering in his eyes. "No trouble," he agreed roughly. They made it through the feast, though the atmosphere was strained. Elizabeth noticed how the other women whispered behind their hands, how conversations stopped when she approached. Only Mrs. Henderson and a few others showed genuine kindness. It was during the barn dance that things came to a head. Elizabeth had convinced Jake to dance one song. He was surprisingly graceful for such a large man, when Samuel reappeared, nose swollen, eyes mean with drink and humiliation. "I want to dance with Mrs. McCord," he announced loudly. "Town tradition, got to dance with all the married ladies." "Find another partner," Jake said flatly. Now. Samuel's smile was ugly. "Wouldn't want people to think you don't trust your wife. Or maybe you know she regrets her choice?" Elizabeth felt the weight of every eye in the barn. This was a test. She realized, not just of Jake's temper, but of their marriage itself. If Jake refused, it would confirm every whisper about their cold, loveless union. If he agreed, "One dance," she said quietly to Jake. "It means nothing." Jake's eyes searched hers. Whatever he saw there made him step back, though his hand lingered on hers for a moment. "One dance," he agreed. Samuel's hands were too familiar as they danced, pulling her closer than proper. "You could have had silk dresses and servants," he whispered. "Instead, you're growing old before your time on that worthless ranch." "It's my ranch," Elizabeth said clearly. "My home, with my husband." "Your husband who bought you like cattle?" Samuel's grip tightened painfully. "Everyone knows why you married him. Everyone pities you." "The only pitiful one here is you," Elizabeth retorted. "A spoiled boy who can't accept that a woman would choose honest work over his father's dirty money?" Samuel's face contorted. "You little—" "The song's over," Jake's voice cut in. He stood beside them, not touching Samuel, but his presence radiating threat. "Thank you for returning my wife." Samuel had no choice but to release her. As Jake led her away, he leaned close and said loudly, "Enjoy her while you can. McCord, women like that always run back to civilization eventually. Just like—" "Don't," Elizabeth said sharply, feeling Jake tense. "Don't you dare finish that sentence." She turned to face the crowd. All pretense of polite ignorance gone. Everyone was watching, waiting to see the forced bride crack. "You want to know about my marriage?" she said, her voice carrying clearly through the barn. "Yes, I was forced to marry. My family was desperate, and Jake McCord was generous enough to help. I won't pretend it was a love match." The crowd murmured. Jake stood frozen beside her. "But you know what I've learned these past months? Jake McCord is worth 10 of any man here. He works from dawn to dusk without complaint. He's fair and honest in all his dealings. He treats me with more respect and kindness than I ever received from those who claim to be civilized." She looked directly at Samuel. "He's never grabbed me against my will, or whispered crude suggestions, or used his power to make me feel small." "Elizabeth," Jake said quietly, but she wasn't finished. "You pity me? Save your pity for yourselves. You sit in town gossiping while we build something real. You judge our marriage while your own houses hide secrets everyone pretends not to know." She scanned the crowd, seeing guilty flinches. "At least Jake and I are honest about what we are to each other." "And what is that?" someone called out. Elizabeth looked up at Jake, seeing surprise, admiration, and something deeper in his eyes. "Partners," she said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a ranch to run." She took Jake's arm and walked out, head high, leaving stunned silence behind them. They made it to the wagon before Jake spoke. "That was, He shook his head. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." Elizabeth climbed up beside him. "I'm tired of their whispers and judgment. Aren't you?" "I stopped caring what town thought years ago." He looked at her sideways. "But this isn't your fight. You shouldn't have to defend a marriage you never wanted. Who says I never wanted it?" The words came out before she could stop them. Jake went still. "Elizabeth, drive," she said softly. "Just drive. We can talk at home." The ride back was silent, but charged with possibility. Once home. Elizabeth busied herself making coffee while Jake tended the horses. When he came in, she had 2 cups waiting by the fire. "You meant it," he said without preamble. "What you said in town." "Which part?" "All of it, but especially—" He struggled with words. "You called it our marriage. Not something forced on you, but ours." Elizabeth stared into her coffee. "It started as force. I won't lie about that. But somewhere along the way—" She looked up at him. "You're a good man, Jake McCord. Better than I deserved, considering I came to you in trade for debt. Don't." His voice was rough. "Don't make me out to be noble. I needed help. You needed rescue. It was a bargain." "Was," Elizabeth agreed. "What is it now?" Jake set down his cup and moved to the window, staring out at the darkness. "Mary and I married for love, young love, all fire and dreams. When I lost her and the baby—" His voice cracked. "I thought I'd never feel anything again. Wanted it that way. Safer." Elizabeth waited, hardly breathing. "Then you came along, fierce and proud even when your world was crashing down. Fighting to learn ranch life even when it bloodied your hands. Standing up to Samuel Blackwood, to the whole damn town." He turned to face her. "You're nothing like Mary. She was gentle, needed protecting. You protect yourself, and somehow you're protecting me too. From what? From turning into stone. From forgetting there's more to life than just surviving." He crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair. "I'm still broken. Elizabeth, part of me always will be. But when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to be alive." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. She reached out, touching his face gently. "We're both broken. Maybe that's why we fit." He caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek. "I don't deserve you defending me like that, standing up for a marriage that started as a business deal." "It's not a business deal anymore," Elizabeth whispered. "Is it?" "No," Jake agreed, his eyes dark with emotion. "No, it's not." They stayed frozen like that for a long moment, balanced on the edge of something new. Then Jake cleared his throat and stood, stepping back. "It's late," he said. "You should rest." Elizabeth stood too, gathering courage. "Jake, your wound, it's healed well. You don't need to sleep by the fire anymore. Unless you want to." He went very still. "Elizabeth, are you asking?" "I'm saying you have a bedroom upstairs. Your back must be aching from that makeshift bed." She moved toward the stairs, paused. "Whatever happens or doesn't, I'd like my husband beside me. If you're willing." Jake studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'm willing." As they climbed the stairs together for the first time, Elizabeth thought about Samuel's cruel words, about the town's whispers. Let them talk. They knew nothing about the quiet strength of the man beside her, nothing about the partnership forged in daily struggle and mutual respect. She was forced to marry, but the cowboy had made her want him, and that made all the difference. The drought began in late October, subtle at first, a few weeks without rain that stretched into a month. By November, the creek that fed their water supply had dwindled to a trickle. The grass turned brown and brittle, crunching underfoot like broken glass. "We need to move the cattle to the north pasture," Jake said one morning, studying the cloudless sky with worried eyes. Still some water in the old reservoir there. Elizabeth had learned to read his moods these past weeks since they'd begun sharing a bed, though he remained a gentleman, never presuming more than she offered. The deepening lines around his eyes told her this drought was worse than he let on. "How long can we last without rain?" she asked, pouring coffee with hands that had grown strong and capable. "Depends. If we're careful with water, ration the grain, maybe through December." He didn't finish the thought, but Elizabeth heard it anyway. After that, they'd start losing cattle, and cattle were everything. They worked together to move the herd, Elizabeth riding the mare Jake had given her, a gentle buckskin named Buttercup. She'd become a passable rider these past months, though Jake still watched her with protective eyes whenever she mounted up. The cattle were restless, bawling their thirst as they searched for grass that wasn't there. Some were already showing ribs, and Elizabeth's heart ached watching calves struggle to keep up with weakening mothers. "There," Jake pointed to a shallow depression where a few puddles of murky water remained. "Not much, but it'll have to do." They spent the day setting up temporary fencing to control access to the water, ensuring each animal got its share without trampling the source into mud. By evening, they were both covered in dust and sweat, exhausted from the brutal sun. "I'll start supper," Elizabeth said as they rode home, but Jake shook his head. "Rest first. You're swaying in that saddle." She was about to protest when she saw it, a dead steer near the fence line. Buzzards already circling. Jake cursed under his breath and rode over to investigate. "Thirst," he said grimly when he returned. "Too weak to make it to water. Won't be the last if this keeps up." That night, Elizabeth woke to find Jake's side of the bed empty. She found him on the porch, staring at the star-filled sky as if he could will clouds to form. "Can't sleep?" she asked, wrapping a shawl around her nightgown and joining him. "Listen," he said quietly. Elizabeth listened but heard nothing unusual, just the normal night sounds of coyotes in the distance and the restless movement of horses in the corral. "I don't hear anything," she said. "Exactly. No insects, no frogs from the creek. The land's going quiet." He rubbed his face tiredly. "Happened like this in '68. Lost half the herd that year." "What did you do?" "Survived. Barely. Sold what cattle lived through it for next to nothing. Took any work I could find to buy feed." His voice dropped. "That was before Mary. After she died. I thought nothing could hurt that much again, but watching everything you've built dry up and blow away, it's a different kind of dying." Elizabeth slipped her hand into his, feeling the calluses and scars of years of hard work. "We'll find a way. We always do." He squeezed her hand but didn't answer. They both knew determination couldn't make it rain. The next weeks were a blur of rationing and worry. Elizabeth learned to save every drop of water. Dishwater went to the garden, now reduced to a few hardy vegetables. Bathwater was shared and reused until it was more dirt than water. She made soup from bones and wild plants, stretching their supplies thin. Jake grew quieter, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. He was up before dawn checking the cattle, often not returning until after dark. When he did, Elizabeth could read the day's losses in the slump of his shoulders. 3 more down, he'd say, or found the Hendersons' cattle wandering, their waterholes dry. Each loss cut deeper, though he tried to hide it. The crisis deepened when their well began showing signs of failing. Jake had to dig it deeper, a dangerous job that left him filthy and exhausted. Elizabeth hauled bucket after bucket of dirt as he dug, her hands blistering anew despite their calluses. "There!" Jake called from deep in the hole. "I hit moisture." But it was barely a trickle, enough for the house but not nearly enough for the livestock. That night, Jake made a decision that Elizabeth knew was killing him. "I'm selling half the herd," he announced. "Better to get something for them now than watch them die." "But the prices?" Elizabeth started. She knew drought prices were robbery, taking advantage of desperate ranchers. "I know, But dead cattle bring nothing. He stared at his plate, unable to eat. I'll drive them to the railhead tomorrow. Collins might give me a fair price. Collins didn't. Jake returned 3 days later with less money than they'd hoped, and eyes that looked hollow. Elizabeth didn't ask for details, just held him that night as he lay rigid beside her, staring at nothing. The next blow came from an unexpected source. Elizabeth was drawing their meager water ration when she heard horses approaching. Her heart leapt. Visitors sometimes brought news of rain elsewhere or offers of help, but it was Samuel Blackwood and his father, both looking prosperous and cool despite the heat. Their horses were glossy with health, clearly getting plenty of water. Mrs. McCord. Josiah Blackwood tipped his hat mockingly. Difficult times. I hear. What do you want? Elizabeth asked, hand moving instinctively toward the shotgun by the door. To help, of course. His smile was cold as winter. I'm prepared to buy your ranch for a generous price. Cash money? Enough for you and McCord to start fresh somewhere with water. The ranch isn't for sale. Everything's for sale in a drought. My dear, just a matter of price. He leaned forward in his saddle. How many cattle have you lost? How many more can you afford to lose? That's our business. Samuel laughed unpleasantly. Your business is dying, just like this land. My father's offering you a way out. You should be grateful. Grateful? Elizabeth's temper flared. For vultures circling our misfortune. Careful, Josiah warned. I'm the only buyer you're likely to find. When McCord comes to his senses, and he will, when the last cow drops, my offer will be considerably less. Pride is expensive in a drought. They rode off, leaving Elizabeth shaking with anger and fear. When Jake returned from checking the water holes, she told him about the visit. His face darkened. Blackwood's been buying up failed ranches all year, he said, pennies on the dollar, building himself an empire on others' misery. We won't sell to him, Elizabeth said firmly. Might not have a choice. Jake slumped in his chair. Lost 2 more head today. At this rate, he trailed off. But they both knew, at this rate, they'd be broke within weeks. That night, a hot wind began to blow, carrying dust that seeped through every crack. Elizabeth woke coughing, eyes burning. The house was thick with it, like fog made of earth. Dust storm, Jake said, already up and checking the windows. Big one. We need to get the livestock to shelter. They wrapped bandanas around their faces and plunged into the brown darkness. The wind howled like a living thing, driving sand that stung exposed skin. Elizabeth could barely see Jake 2 feet ahead of her. The cattle were panicking, milling in frightened circles. Working by feel more than sight, they managed to drive most into the barn, cramming them in until there was barely room to move. The horses went into the smaller shelter, wild-eyed with fear. Buttercup, Elizabeth called, realizing her mare was missing. Jake, I can't find Buttercup. She probably ran for the ravine, Jake shouted over the wind. Natural shelter. She'll be all right. But Elizabeth heard the doubt in his voice. Animals got lost in storms like this, buried in drifts of dust or running blind off cliffs. She thought of the gentle mare that had become her friend, and tears mixed with the grit in her eyes. They stumbled back to the house, exhausted and coated in dirt. The storm raged for hours, making the walls creak and windows rattle. They huddled together, trying not to think about what they'd find when it passed. Dawn came pale and strange through dust-hazed air. Jake ventured out first, returning with a grim report. Lost at least 10 head, buried or scattered. Feeds ruined, too much dust mixed in. And Elizabeth, his voice gentled. I found Buttercup. She knew from his tone, her mare was gone. Another casualty of the merciless land. Elizabeth pressed her face against Jake's dusty shirt and let herself cry for all of it. The mare, the cattle, the dying ranch, the helplessness of fighting nature itself. Hey, Jake said softly, holding her. We're not beaten yet. Still got some cattle, still got each other. For how long? Elizabeth pulled back to look at him. How long before we have to take Blackwood's offer? We'll find another way. Rain has to come eventually. But they both heard the hollow hope in his words. That night, as they lay in bed listening to coyotes fighting over the carcasses, Elizabeth voiced what they both were thinking. "I won't let you lose this ranch because of me," she said quietly. "If taking Blackwood's money means you can start over, no." Jake's voice was fierce. "This ranch is ours. Win or lose, we do it together. I didn't marry you to give up when things got hard. You married me for help with the ranch. I'm not much help if the ranch is dying." Jake turned to face her in the darkness. "Is that what you think? That you're only worth something if the ranch succeeds?" "Aren't I?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "The night we moved the cattle, you worked alongside me for 12 hours without complaint. When I was digging the well, you hauled dirt until your hands bled. Tonight, in that storm, you risked your life for the animals." His hand found hers. "Elizabeth, don't you understand? The ranch might fail, probably will, if it doesn't rain soon. But you, what we've built together, that's not failing. That's the only thing keeping me going." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "Jake, I love you," he said simply. "Didn't mean to. Fought it hard, but somewhere between you standing up to the town and crying over a lost mare, I fell completely." He laughed shakily. "Hell of a time to realize it, when I might lose everything." "You won't lose me," Elizabeth whispered. "Ranch or no ranch, rain or drought, I choose you. Jake McCord, I choose us." They held each other as the wind picked up again, rattling the windows with renewed fury. Outside, the land was dying, but inside, something lived and fierce bloomed between them, not despite the hardship, but because of how they faced it together. The drought would test them further in the days to come, but for now, in the darkness of their besieged home, they had each other, and somehow, that was enough to hope on. The rider appeared on the horizon just after dawn, moving fast. Elizabeth shaded her eyes against the rising sun, trying to make out who would be riding so hard in this heat. Jake emerged from the barn, instantly alert. "That's Tom Henderson," he said, tension in his voice. "Something's wrong." Tom Henderson pulled up in a cloud of dust, his usually calm face creased with worry. "Jake, Elizabeth, we got trouble. Josiah Blackwood just filed claim on your water rights. Says you haven't been maintaining the boundary markers proper." "What?" Jake's face darkened. "Those markers have been in place since my father's time. Not anymore, they haven't." Tom spat in the dust. "Found 3 of them pulled up this morning when I was checking my own boundaries. Blackwood's men were already there. Surveying, they said. Sheriff's with them." Elizabeth felt her heart sink. Water rights were everything in drought time. Without legal access to what little water remained, they were finished. "Saddle the horses," Jake said quietly to Elizabeth. "We're riding out there now." They found Sheriff Watson at the disputed boundary, looking uncomfortable as he stood between Blackwood's hired guns and the precious water source. Josiah Blackwood sat on his horse like a king surveying conquered territory. Samuel beside him with a satisfied smirk. "Ah, McCord," Josiah said pleasantly. "Come to see the new property lines." "Those are my markers," Jake said evenly. "Have been for 20 years. "Can you prove it?" The sheriff shifted nervously. "Mister, Blackwood has a surveyor's report saying this section was never properly claimed." "Because someone pulled up the markers," Elizabeth burst out. "This is theft." "Careful with accusations, Mrs. McCord," Josiah warned. "Slander is a serious matter. I'm simply claiming abandoned water rights, as is my legal right." Jake dismounted slowly, his hand carefully away from his gun, despite the armed men watching. "Watson, you know those markers. You've seen them yourself." "Maybe I have, maybe I haven't." The sheriff wouldn't meet his eyes. "Without proof, the proof is 20 years of use," Jake said. "My father dug that reservoir. I've maintained it every season." "Except this season," Samuel pointed out. Been too busy letting your cattle die to maintain proper boundaries, haven't you? Jake took a step forward, but Elizabeth caught his arm. Don't. That's what they want. Listen to your wife, McCord. Josiah advised. No need for unpleasantness. I'll make you the same offer as before, fair price for the ranch. Enough to relocate somewhere water isn't an issue. Go to hell, Jake said flatly. Josiah sighed theatrically. Such language in front of a lady. Very well. Sheriff, please inform Mr. McCord of the legal situation. Watson cleared his throat miserably. Water rights revert to open claim if boundaries ain't maintained. Mr. Blackwood filed proper like this morning. You can dispute it in court, but... He shrugged helplessly. But court took time and money they didn't have. And everyone knew Judge Carter owed his position to Blackwood influence. It was checkmate, legal and ruthless. You have until tomorrow to remove any cattle from this area, Josiah said. After that, they'll be trespassing on Blackwood land. They rode home in bitter silence. Without that water, the remaining cattle would die within days. Jake's jaw was set so tight Elizabeth feared he'd crack teeth. We'll go to the county seat, she said. File a protest. There must be honest judges somewhere. With what money? Jake's voice was hollow. Blackwood knows we're broke. He's counting on it. That night, Elizabeth found Jake cleaning his guns with methodical precision. What are you planning? Nothing good. He didn't look up. But I won't let him steal what my father built. Jake, please. Violence won't solve this. What will? He finally met her eyes, and the despair there made her heart clench. I've tried doing things right, working hard, staying honest, and where has it gotten us? Elizabeth knelt beside him, taking his hands. It's gotten us together. That's worth more than land or cattle. You can't eat togetherness, can't drink it when the wells run dry. He pulled away. You should go to your family for a while. Until this is over. Don't you dare. Elizabeth's temper flared. Don't you dare try to send me away. We're partners, remember? For better or worse. This is definitely worse. Then we face it together. She stood, mind racing. There has to be another way. What about the other ranchers? They must see what Blackwood's doing. If everyone stands together, with what? Jake laughed bitterly. We're all hanging by threads. Nobody can afford to cross Blackwood. But Elizabeth wasn't ready to give up. The next morning, she saddled one of their remaining horses and rode to neighboring ranches. What she found broke her heart. The Millers packing to leave, having already sold to Blackwood. The Carters down to their last few cattle. Everyone struggling. Everyone afraid. But at the Thorpe Ranch, she found an unexpected ally. Ruth Thorpe, a widow managing alone since her husband's death, listened to Elizabeth's plea with sharp eyes. Blackwood tried the same with us last month, Ruth said. Claimed our creek was on his property. My boy Charlie saw them pulling up markers in the night. Did you fight it? Couldn't afford to, but I kept the original survey maps my husband filed. Been hiding them. Ruth studied Elizabeth. You thinking what I'm thinking? If we can prove Blackwood's been systematically stealing land, we'd need more than my maps. Need witnesses, other documents. And we'd need someone with power to listen. Elizabeth thought of her father's old friend, now a federal marshal. I might know someone, but we'd need evidence. They spent the afternoon planning. Ruth knew others who'd been forced off their land. The Hendersons had seen Blackwood's men near torn-down markers. Old Sam Martinez remembered when Jake's father had filed those water rights. Might even have papers. It's dangerous, Ruth warned. Blackwood won't hesitate to silence us if he knows what we're doing. Then we'd better work fast. Elizabeth returned home to find Jake preparing to move the cattle away from the disputed water. His face was grim, movements sharp with suppressed rage. She told him about Ruth and the possibility of exposing Blackwood. It's a long shot, Jake said, and if Blackwood gets wind of it, we have to try, unless you have a better plan than shooting it out with his hired guns. Jake's smile was worn but real. When did you get so strategic? When I married a stubborn rancher who needed saving from himself. She helped him saddle up. Come on, let's move these cattle, then pay some visits. They spent 2 days gathering evidence, riding from ranch to ranch under cover of darkness. What they found was damning. A pattern of stolen land, pulled markers, forged documents. Blackwood had been building his empire on theft, using the drought as cover. But on the 3rd night, as they met secretly in the Henderson barn, Samuel Blackwood walked in with 3 armed men. Well, a conspiracy. Samuel's smile was vicious. My father will be interested to hear about this. Jake stepped protectively in front of Elizabeth. This is Henderson property. You're trespassing. Am I? Samuel nodded to Tom Henderson, who stood frozen with fear. Tom, tell them about your new mortgage, the one my father holds. Tom's face crumpled. I'm sorry. Jake, they knew you were coming. Said they'd foreclose if I didn't. It's all right. Tom. Jake's voice was steady, but Elizabeth could feel the tension radiating from him. You did what you had to, just like you're going to. Samuel said, Here's what happens now. You all go home and forget this meeting happened. McCord, you take my father's offer by tomorrow noon. Everyone else keeps quiet, and maybe their loans don't get called in early. Or, Jake asked quietly. Samuel's hand moved to his gun. Or things get unpleasant, starting with your pretty wife. Accidents happen on remote ranches. Women disappear. Tragic, really. Jake moved so fast Elizabeth barely saw it. One moment Samuel was threatening them. The next, he was on the ground with Jake's knee on his chest and his own gun pressed to his temple. Touch her and I'll kill you, Jake said, voice deadly calm. Money or no money, men or no men, I'll hunt you down and kill you slow. Jake, Elizabeth grabbed his arm. Don't, he's not worth hanging for. For a moment, the barn was silent except for Samuel's panicked breathing. Then Jake stood, keeping the gun. Get out. Tell your father he has a choice. Leave us alone or I'll take those documents to the federal marshal myself. And if anything happens to anyone here, I'll make sure he hangs for it. Samuel scrambled up, face twisted with rage and humiliation. You're dead, McCord. All of you are dead. After they left, the gathered ranchers looked at each other in fear and determination. Ruth Thorpe spoke first. Well, no going back now. We'd better make this count. They worked through the night, copying documents, writing statements. At dawn, Elizabeth and Jake set out for the county seat with the evidence, knowing Blackwood's men would likely try to stop them. They'd gotten 10 miles when the ambush came. Gunfire erupted from a rocky outcropping, sending their horses into panic. Jake shoved Elizabeth behind a boulder as bullets whined overhead. How many? Elizabeth gasped. Fumbling for the rifle Jake had insisted she carry. 3, maybe 4. Jake returned fire, his shots carefully placed. They're trying to pin us down. Elizabeth peered around the rock, saw movement to their left. They're flanking us. She raised the rifle, hands steady despite her fear, and fired. A yelp told her she'd hit someone. Jake glanced at her with grim pride. That's my girl. Keep them honest on that side. The firefight seemed to last forever but was probably only minutes. Jake's deadly accuracy and Elizabeth's unexpected skill eventually drove the attackers off, leaving one dead in blood trails suggesting others were wounded. We need to move, Jake said, checking her for injuries. They'll be back with more men. They rode hard, pushing the horses to their limits. By the time they reached the federal marshal's office, their mounts were lathered and blown. Marshal Robert Clayton, Elizabeth's father's old friend, listened to their story with increasing anger. I've been watching Blackwood for years, he said. Never had enough proof. This changes everything. He studied the documents. You two did good, real good, but you'll need protection until I can arrest him. We can't leave the ranch, Jake protested. What cattle we have left? We'll die anyway if you're dead. Clayton said bluntly. I'll send deputies to guard your place. Should have Blackwood in custody by week's end. They rode back with 2 deputies, finding the ranch intact but tense. Word had spread about the ambush. Several neighboring ranchers had come to help defend the place if needed. "Appreciate it," Jake told them, but hopefully it won't come to that. That night, as they stood watch together, Elizabeth leaned against Jake's solid warmth. "We might actually win this. Maybe." He pulled her closer. "But even if we do, we're still broke. Ranch is still dying. We'll figure it out. Sell some land, maybe. Focus on what we can save." Jake kissed her temple. "When did I get so lucky to marry such a fighter?" "When you were smart enough to offer my father money," Elizabeth said dryly. "Best investment you ever made." He chuckled, the first genuine laugh she'd heard in days. "Damn right it was." In the distance, thunder rumbled. Elizabeth looked up, hardly daring to hope. Clouds were building on the horizon, dark and heavy with promise. "Jake," she whispered. "Look." He followed her gaze, and she felt him tense with desperate hope. Could be nothing. Seen clouds build and blow over before. But the air felt different, heavy and electric. The horses were restless in a new way, and even the cattle seemed to sense change coming. Or it could be everything, Elizabeth said. They stood together, watching the sky and waiting, for rain, for justice, for whatever came next. They'd fought for their land, their rights, their love. Now all they could do was hope it was enough. The storm broke just after midnight, but it wasn't the salvation they'd prayed for. Lightning split the sky while thunder shook the house, yet only a few drops of rain fell. Instead, the wind brought fire. Elizabeth woke to Jake, shaking her roughly. "Get up! Fire on the ridge!" She stumbled to the window and gasped. The horizon glowed orange, and the wind was driving flames straight toward their ranch. In drought-dried country, wildfire was death incarnate. "Lightning strike," Jake said, already pulling on his boots. "We've got to get the animals out." They worked frantically in the hellish glow, releasing horses and driving cattle away from the advancing flames. The deputies Marshal Clayton had left helped, but Elizabeth could see they were fighting a losing battle. The fire moved faster than anything alive. "The house!" Elizabeth cried. "We have to save what we can." "No time," Jake shouted over the roar of approaching flames. "Lives first, property second." But Elizabeth ran inside anyway, grabbing the small box that held their marriage certificate, Jake's mother's Bible, and the few precious photographs Jake kept of his first family. She understood now why they mattered. They were pieces of who he'd been, who they were becoming together. "Elizabeth, damn it!" Jake appeared in the doorway. "We have to go now." The fire crested the ridge as they mounted their horses. Elizabeth looked back once at their home, the garden she'd coaxed from stubborn soil, the barn where she'd learned to milk cows and birth calves. Then Jake grabbed her reins, and they fled into the night. They made it to the Hendersons' property just as dawn broke, revealing the devastation. A black scar stretched across the land where their ranch had been. The house and barn were gone, reduced to smoking ruins. Of their cattle, they'd saved maybe 30 head. Everything else was ash and memory. Jake sat on his exhausted horse, staring at the destruction with empty eyes. Elizabeth reached for his hand, finding it trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. It's gone," he said hollowly. "All of it. 20 years of work, my father's legacy, our home." His voice broke. Tom Henderson approached carefully. "Jake, Elizabeth, you're welcome here as long as you need. It's the least I can do after—" He couldn't finish, shame heavy in his words. They spent the day in a daze, helping other ranchers who'd lost property to the fire. By evening, word came that made everything worse. Josiah Blackwood was claiming the fire had conveniently destroyed evidence against him. Without the documents, Marshal Clayton's case was weakened. "The originals," Elizabeth said suddenly. "Ruth Thorpe has the original surveys. They weren't at our place." Hope flickered briefly before another rider arrived with grim news. The Thorpe ranch had burned too, and Ruth was missing. "No," Elizabeth breathed. "They couldn't have—" Jake's face hardened into something dangerous. "Stay here," he told Elizabeth. Like hell. She was already checking her rifle. "We're partners, remember? They rode out with 2 deputies. finding the Thorpe ranch in ruins. But there was something wrong with the scene. The fire pattern didn't match the others. This wasn't wind-driven wildfire damage. Kerosene, one deputy said, sniffing near the foundation. This was set deliberate. They found Ruth Thorpe an hour later, alive but badly injured, hidden in the root cellar. She was unconscious, suffering from smoke inhalation and a head wound that looked suspiciously like a pistol blow. "Get her to town," Jake ordered the deputies. "Fast." As they fashioned a travois, Ruth stirred, gripping Elizabeth's hand with surprising strength. "Box," she wheezed. "Under the old oak. Saved documents." They found it. A metal box buried beneath the massive oak tree that had somehow survived the flames. Inside were the original surveys and more. Letters, contracts, proof of Blackwood's schemes going back years. "This is it," Elizabeth breathed. "This will hang him." But Jake's expression was grim. "If we live long enough to use it." The attack came on the road back to town. This time, Blackwood's men weren't trying to scare or wound. They meant to kill. Bullets shattered the air around them as they dove for cover in a dry wash. "How many?" Elizabeth asked, checking her ammunition with steady hands that surprised her. "Too many." Jake's face was set. 8, maybe 10. They've got us pinned." Elizabeth heard horses circling, trying to flank them. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Jake knew it too. She could see it in his eyes as he looked at her. "Elizabeth," he started. "Don't you dare tell me to run," she said fiercely. "I was going to say I love you," he replied with a ghost of a smile. "In case I don't get another chance." "You will." She kissed him hard, tasting dust and desperation. "We're not dying in this wash." The gunfire intensified, bullets chipping rocks above their heads. Then Elizabeth heard something else. Hoofbeats. Many hoofbeats, coming fast. "Jake!" Tom Henderson's voice rang out. "Hold on!" The cavalry that crested the rise wasn't military. It was their neighbors, every rancher who'd lost land to Blackwood, every family the McCords had helped over the years. They came armed and angry, turning the ambush into a rout. Blackwood's hired guns, faced with unexpected odds, scattered like coyotes. Several didn't make it, cut down by men who'd had enough of being bullied. "Thought you might need help," Tom said, sliding from his saddle. "Ruth woke up long enough to tell us where you'd gone. We figured Blackwood might try something." "Tom," Jake said, voice rough with emotion. "After what happened, I was scared," Tom admitted. "We all were. But watching you two fight for what's right, even after losing everything, made us remember what courage looks like." They made it to town to find Marshal Clayton had already moved. With the rescued documents and Ruth Thorpe's testimony, he'd arrested Josiah Blackwood. The man who'd terrorized the county for years was finally in custody. Samuel Blackwood, trying to flee, had been caught by some very angry ranchers. He was alive, but barely, and singing like a bird about his father's crimes in exchange for protection. "It's over," Marshal Clayton told them. "With what you've gathered, Blackwood will hang for sure. The land he stole will be returned to rightful owners." "Bit late for us," Jake said quietly. "Ranch is gone." "About that," Clayton smiled. "Seems the grateful citizens have been talking. There's a fund started, money to help you rebuild, and the judge has agreed to award damages from Blackwood's assets. You'll have enough to start over and then some." Elizabeth felt her knees go weak with relief. Jake caught her, holding her steady as he always did. "There's more," Clayton continued. "That storm last night? It was the beginning. Weather Service says a proper storm system is coming in. The drought's breaking." As if on cue, thunder rumbled overhead. This time, the rain that followed wasn't a tease. It came down steady and strong, soaking the thirsty ground. They stood in the street, letting the rain wash away weeks of dust and fear. Around them, people emerged from buildings, faces turned skyward in wonder and gratitude. "We can rebuild," Jake said, rain streaming down his face. "Make it better than before." "We will," Elizabeth agreed. Then, louder, for anyone who cared to hear, This is our home, our land, and nobody, not drought, not fire, not greedy men, will take that from us again." Jake pulled her close, and there in the middle of Main Street, in front of God and everyone, he kissed her like a man who'd nearly lost everything and finally understood what truly mattered. "You know," he said when they finally parted, "when I paid your father's debts, I thought I was just buying help for the ranch." "And now?" Elizabeth asked, though she already knew. "Now I know I got something worth more than land or cattle or rain." He touched her face gently. "I got you, and you, Elizabeth McCord, are worth fighting for." They stayed there in the rain, holding each other while the town celebrated around them. The ranch was gone, but it could be rebuilt. The drought was breaking. Justice had finally come to Clearwater, but most importantly, they'd survived it together. A forced marriage had become a true partnership, tested by fire and strengthened by adversity. Whatever came next, they'd face it side by side. The rain fell harder, washing the black scars from the land, promising new growth where there had been only ash. It was ending and beginning all at once, destruction clearing the way for something stronger and better. "Ready to go home?" Jake asked. Elizabeth looked at the man she'd been forced to marry but had chosen to love. "I am home," she said simply. And there in the cleansing rain, with their whole lives to rebuild ahead of them, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 6 months later, Elizabeth stood on the rise overlooking their new home, marveling at how much had changed. Where blackened earth had once stretched to the horizon, green grass now rippled in the spring breeze. The new ranch house, built with help from neighbors and funds from Blackwood's seized assets, was larger than the old one, with real glass windows and a wraparound porch. "What do you think?" Jake asked, coming up behind her, his arms sliding around her waist. "I think it's perfect," she said, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Though I might have been happy in a soddy, as long as you were there." "No more soddies for my wife," Jake said firmly. "We've earned better." They had. The past months had been a whirlwind of rebuilding, not just structures but lives. With the drought broken and Blackwood in prison awaiting execution, the county had flourished. Ranchers who'd been driven to near bankruptcy were recovering. The community that had been fractured by fear had grown stronger. "Letter came from your mother," Jake said, producing an envelope. "Looks like good news." Elizabeth opened it eagerly. Her mother's consumption had improved dramatically at the Denver sanitarium, and she was well enough to travel. The letter said she'd be visiting next month, along with Elizabeth's sisters. "They'll be shocked," Elizabeth laughed. "Last time they saw me, I was a desperate girl in a forced marriage. Now you're a rancher's wife who can outride half the men in the county and shoots better than most." Jake finished. "They'll be proud. I hope so." Elizabeth turned in his arms. "Jake, there's something I need to tell you." His eyes immediately filled with concern. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She took his hand, placing it on her still flat stomach. "Everything's very right. We're going to have a baby." Jake went perfectly still, his face cycling through emotions: shock, joy, fear, wonder. "A baby," he whispered. "You're sure?" "Doc Morrison confirmed it yesterday. I'm about 3 months along." 3 months? Jake's eyes widened. "That means, during the worst of everything, the fire, the fighting, Elizabeth, you should have told me. I never would have let you." "Which is exactly why I didn't tell you," she interrupted. "We were fighting for our lives, our home. I wasn't going to sit on the sidelines." "Stubborn woman," he said, but his voice was thick with emotion. "My brave, stubborn, wonderful wife." He dropped to his knees, pressing his face against her stomach. "Hello, little one. I'm your papa, and I promise you, I'll do better this time. I'll be here, always." Elizabeth ran her fingers through his hair, understanding. He'd lost his first child while away on a cattle drive. This time would be different. "We both will be." she promised. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching wagons. The barn raising they'd organized was bringing friends from across the county. Soon the ranch was filled with activity, men hauling timber, women setting up outdoor kitchens, children running between the workers' legs. Ruth Thorpe, recovered from her injuries and rebuilding her own ranch, pulled Elizabeth aside. "How are you feeling, honey? You look a bit green." "Morning sickness," Elizabeth admitted. "Though why they call it morning sickness when it lasts all day?" Ruth's face lit up. "A baby! Oh, Elizabeth, how wonderful. After everything you've been through, you deserve this happiness." "We all do," Elizabeth said, watching Jake work alongside the other men. He caught her eye and winked, and her heart fluttered just as it had that first time she'd really seen him, not as the man she was forced to marry, but as the partner she'd chosen. The barn went up quickly with so many hands helping. As the sun began to set, they gathered for a feast. Tom Henderson stood to make a toast. "To Jake and Elizabeth McCord," he said, raising his glass. "Who showed us all what courage looks like? Who fought when it would have been easier to run? Who reminded us that we're stronger together than alone?" "Hear, hear," the crowd echoed. Jake stood, pulling Elizabeth up with him. "Thank you all. 6 months ago, I thought I'd lost everything. The ranch, the cattle, the life I'd built." He looked at Elizabeth. "But I learned something. Home isn't buildings or land. It's the people you stand with when everything goes to hell. It's the woman who faces down gunmen and still finds time to tend your wounds. It's neighbors who ride to your rescue when you need them most." He raised his own glass. "To second chances, to rain after drought, to love that grows in the unlikeliest places, and to the future we're building together." As everyone drank and cheered, Elizabeth felt the baby flutter, the first quickening. She gasped, grabbing Jake's hand and placing it on her stomach. "Did you feel that?" she whispered. His eyes went wide. "Was that—" "Our baby, moving." They stood there, oblivious to the celebration around them, marveling at the life they'd created in the midst of death and destruction. This child would know only the ranch reborn, the community united, parents who'd chosen each other through trial by fire. Later that evening, as guests began departing, Jake and Elizabeth walked through their new home. It still smelled of fresh lumber and possibility. The bedroom windows faced east. Jake's insisted on that, so they could watch the sunrise together. "I've been thinking," Elizabeth said as they stood on the porch, watching the last wagons disappear into the dusk. "About what you said, about home being people, not places." "It's true," Jake said. "Learned that the hard way." "I was forced to marry you," Elizabeth said softly. "We both know that's how it started. A business transaction. A desperate choice." "Elizabeth, let me finish." She turned to face him fully. "I was forced to marry you, but nobody forced me to love you. That was my choice, the best choice I ever made." Jake cupped her face in his weathered hands. "You saved me," he said simply. "I was dying inside, just going through the motions. Then you came along with your fierce spirit and your gentle heart, and you brought me back to life." "We saved each other," Elizabeth corrected. "That's what partners do." They stood together as stars began appearing in the vast Wyoming sky. The land around them bore scars, places where fire had burned, where drought had killed, but green shoots pushed through the damage, and with time, even the scars would fade. "What do you think, boy or girl?" Jake asked, his hand finding her stomach again. "I don't care. As long as they're healthy." Elizabeth smiled. "Though I hope they get your strength and your courage." "And your fire," Jake added. "Your refusal to give up, your ability to see hope where others see only ash." A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another, once. That sound had frightened Elizabeth. Now it was just part of the vast symphony of their land, no more threatening than thunder or wind. "We should go in," Jake said. "You need rest." "In a moment." Elizabeth wasn't ready to leave this perfect evening. "I want to remember this. All of it. How far we've come. From a forced marriage to this." Jake mused. If someone had told me that day I came to your father's house that I'd end up madly in love with the woman I was buying out of desperation, you'd have run for the hills." Elizabeth finished. "No," Jake said seriously. "I'd have paid double." Elizabeth laughed, the sound carrying across their land that had tested them, nearly broken them, but ultimately made them stronger. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The baby would come in autumn, hopefully to a world made better by their struggles. There would be other droughts, other troubles, because that was the nature of life on the frontier. But tonight, they were home, really home, in the truest sense. Not just the place, but the life they'd built together. The marriage that had begun in desperation had become something precious, refined by hardship into pure gold. "Ready now?" Jake asked. Elizabeth took one last look at their domain, the new barn, the recovering pastures, the endless sky full of promise. Then she looked at her husband, the cowboy who'd made her want him without trying, who'd given her a life she hadn't known she wanted until she was living it. "I'm ready," she said. Hand in hand, they went inside, closing the door on the past and opening their hearts to whatever future awaited. In the growing child, in the rebuilt ranch, in the love that had surprised them both. Hope lived and thrived. They had been forced together by circumstance, but they stayed together by choice. And in the end, that choice, renewed daily in small acts of courage and kindness, made all the difference. The lamp in the window glowed warmly as night settled over the ranch, a beacon of home in the vast darkness. Inside, Jake and Elizabeth McCord prepared for bed, for tomorrow, for the rest of their lives together. The forced bride and the lonely cowboy had found their way to love, and neither would ever be alone again. As the coyotes sang to the stars and the wind whispered through new grass, the ranch slept peacefully. But it was no longer just a ranch. It was a testament to the power of two hearts that had chosen each other against all odds, and that, more than deeds or fences or buildings, made it truly and forever home. Thank you so much for joining me on this emotional journey through the Wild West. I hope Elizabeth and Jake's story touched your heart as much as it touched mine. Where are you listening to this story from? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to connect with listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about this tale of forced marriage that bloomed into true love. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to share more stories with you.